I didn't have anything to do with it. It just happened by itself.
We had about 5 minutes this morning.
It rained this morning as I was driving in this morning, and Layla, my 4-year-old, was in the car with me, and it was a rainbow. Look, Daddy, rainbow. That made her very happy. The only thing that could have made it better, there was a unicorn on that rainbow because she's 4. And so unicorns and rainbows are the most important things that could happen in her world. For sure. At least one person appreciates the humor of having a 4-year-old.
Rabbi.
Good morning, Lorraine. How are we feeling?
Fine.
Good.
Howard's pretty good too. We're both
That's
negative.
right here.
Yeah.
That's where I Sue. Is Howard hiding over there?
No, he's talking to Jill on the phone.
Okay, good.
But he'll be here in a minute.
I'm sure I'll get a report later today from Jill.
Yes.
All right. Well, good morning. Or I guess I should say good afternoon, everybody. It is noon. Thank you. I'm noticing we've got a lot of new folks this week from the last couple of weeks, which is fantastic. And so welcome to the new folks. Welcome to the returning folks. Our conversation on Honi the Circlemaker, a story that we have spent the last couple of weeks pulling apart and beginning to now put back together. Today, our plan is certainly to finish looking at the text of the story from the Yerushalmi, from the Jerusalem Talmud, and then we'll see where that conversation takes us. We can either jump back into the text from the Babylonian this afternoon, or we can hold it all for next week and for our final conversation. But for those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'm Rabbi Greg Weisman. I'm one of the rabbis at Temple Beth El in Boca Raton, and this conversation on Honi the Circlemaker, most of which should be credited to Rabbi Dr. Aaron Pankin of blessed memory, who was one of my teachers and was a teacher at the Hebrew Union College, the president of the Hebrew Union College, before his untimely passing several years ago. And he had taught the story of Honi in his class, in a course that he taught called 12 Tremendous Texts, where he looked at 12 stories from Talmud and taught them to upper level rabbinic students. And he also wrote a really interesting paper called Telling Retellings, Honi the Circlemaker and the Development of the Rabbinic Narrative Discourse. Most of the scholarship that I'm sharing in the course comes from that particular collection. And not to sound self-aggrandizing, but like it's pretty deep scholarship, and that's the joy of being a rabbi, is I get to take something that like even makes my brain go as I'm trying to figure it out, but then share it with the people that I know and love so well, and open their eyes to this really interesting background to a story. And a note about translation again: the translations in general are from Sefaria.org, unless they're coming from other places. So Honi, as we talked about in the first few weeks, who was Honi, right? He could have been a martyr. He could have seen as a prophet. He could have been a magician or a miracle worker. He could have been a pious man. He could have been a charismatic holy man. He could have been a devout man who simply prayed. And the question that all this hangs on has a lot to do with whether or not Honi was doing what God wanted, whether or not God was doing what Honi wanted but God didn't want, right? And these these words tend to have a lot to do with sort of who's in charge, whose thoughts are the one governing the conversation, and who's ultimately pulling the strings. So, for example, a prophet, as we understand it in our tradition, a prophet is someone who shares the word of God and God's intentions with everybody else. Who was the most effective prophet in Jewish history? Who was the best prophet ever? Moses. Right? The Torah ends with the phrase, Lo kam b'Yisrael navi od kamoshe. Never again did there arise in Israel a prophet like Moses. But we also know there were a lot of other prophets in addition to Moses, right? Got a whole book of them. Samuel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the 12 minor prophets. For the most part, their job was to share God's intention with the world and do a little bit of tattletelling on them back to God when they weren't doing the things that God had asked them to do, right? Mostly they were talking about the kings, who were doing things that they weren't supposed to do. And most of that was offering sacrifices to God in the right manner and at the right occasion, but in the wrong location. But in the story of Honi, as we see, we have a little bit of a different dynamic. Honi is asked by the people to ask God to do something that God already wasn't doing. To situate us in time, the story tends to follow this particular narrative, which is that somewhere in the days or weeks approaching Passover, somewhere as we are getting near the end of the rainy season in the land of Israel, it hasn't rained all season, which would be cataclysmic for the community because there would not be enough water in the storehouses, in the cisterns, in the wells, in the buckets to help the people survive the 6 months of dry that is about to come. Anyone who spent any time either in the Middle East or the land of Israel during the season, during a year, if you live in California, it's a very similar climate where it rains in the winter and it's dry in the summer. For those of us who are in South Florida, that is the opposite of our experience, where we can feel pretty confident it's going to rain most days. It already rained today here in Boca Raton, but we know that it's going to be dry from like October, November, for the most part, all the way until the spring. We have the dry season in the winter. So the situation that prompted the story of Honi was that it hadn't rained all winter, and the people were worried. And so they went to Honi because they knew Honi to be a man who God treated like one of the family, right? Who could be audacious and ask things of God that most people felt like they couldn't ask of God. For those of you who have somewhat healthy or very healthy relationships with your parents, or who have children with whom you have a fairly healthy relationship, you know that what your kid could ask you is probably different and greater than what your neighbor's kid could ask of you in good conscience. Or what you could ask of your parents is more than what you would ask of someone else's parents, or what your friends could ask of your parents. And so Honi was in that relationship with God, at least in the perspective of everybody else, that Honi could ask God to do things that other folks couldn't do. And the story of Honi, as we've learned over the last few weeks, appears to us in 5 iterations. An iteration by Josephus, who was I'll use the word quote unquote historian, meaning he did what was in his generation history. A professor of history today would say that what Josephus was doing was not history, but sort of a running commentary on what was going on. But be that as it may, he was creating a record through the lens of his own perspective as to what was happening in the last few centuries before the Common Era, during the Roman period. And there's a story of Honi, although he was called Onias in that period, but a story that has the same tropes as the story of Honi given to us by Josephus. The story is then recorded within the Jewish community for the first times, in the Tosefta and in the Mishnah. The Tosefta and the Mishnah were redacted both in the 2nd century of the Common Era. And at least for the purposes of our discussion, the presumption is that the story of Honi in the Tosefta predated the story of Honi in the Mishnah, for the very simple reason that there's a lot more information in the story in the Mishnah than in the Tosefta. And so the scholars suggest that because the Tosefta's text is a lot more limited, it probably came first. There wouldn't have been a reason for there to be a redaction of the story of Honi and the other way. But they both come from the same era, from that 2nd century of the Common Era. And then the story in the Mishnah, which was a great expansion, was expounded and expanded upon in the Jerusalem Talmud, which we're going to look at again today. And then we finally get what we call our authoritative version in the Babylonian Talmud around the 600s or 700s of the Common Era. The trope of the story is essentially the same, with the exception of Josephus. But the trope is it's before Passover, it hasn't rained all winter. They go to Honi, he asks God for rain, a little bit of rain falls. Honi says that isn't enough. A lot of rain falls. Honi says that's good. it's too much, and he asks God to pull back, and God pulls back, and they have the rain that they need. A note of context: what was the entree for this conversation? Why are the rabbis even talking about this? To introduce this story of Honi. And the conversation has to do with when can the community cry out, and how so in a moment of calamity, right? I mentioned that there not being rain was a calamity. And so this entire conversation is framed in the section of the Mishnah, the Tosefta, and the Talmud known as Ta'anit, as fasts, public fasts, because one of the things the community might do when there isn't enough rain is engage in a public fast. Rains are seen to be are understood by the tradition to be as what we get for doing the right thing. If we follow the rules, the rains will fall in their season, they will water our fields, and we will have a bounty. And if we don't, then we're not going to get that. So the fast is a way to show our repentance, our tshuva, for what may have gone wrong, and to try to convince God to do for us what it is that we need, which is why it's framed in this conversation. But the rabbis also suggest, and we see this in the text, and we'll start here with the Yerushalmi to bring it up. And we looked at this last week. Rabbi Jonah, Rabbi Shimon ben Abba, the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the thing to do about what is to say enough is the blessing. You can never say there is enough blessing until our lips wear out saying, according to Rabbi Barachia and Rabbi Chelbo and Rav Abba Bar Eli and Rav, until your lips have worn out saying we will have enough blessings, we have had enough blessings. And so the question that really Honi explores is, not only should we cry out when there isn't enough rain, but what would happen, what should we do if there is too much rain? And since we've got a bunch of folks in the conversation, now I'm going to ask this question as an entree to move forward. What is wrong with the idea of saying that we're having too much rain? And I want to invite those of you who heard my answer to that question last week to not share that answer right away. But what is wrong with us saying there is too much rain? Go ahead and raise your hand or unmute yourself if you want to try to answer that question. Anita Eidenberg. Hang on, Anita, you got to unmute yourself first so we can. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
We can. Go ahead.
Okay. That's criticizing God.
That's criticizing God. Okay. That's a fair answer, right? God, you caused the rains to fall. And if we ask you to make it stop, we are criticizing God. That's true. But I'm going to offer Anita a however to that. It could also be seen as criticizing God by asking for rain, following the same logic. And we don't really have a concern in asking for rain, right? As long as we recognize that a lack of rain might be as the result of our own decisions, our own behaviors, right? That's the general theological principle that's introduced mostly in the book of Deuteronomy that says, Margaret, I see your hand, I'll call you in a second, that says, if you follow the laws and do well, then the rains will come in their seasons. And if you don't, they won't. So if it's not raining, we know why. It's because of what we did. Margaret, what did you want to add to the conversation?
To ask if there has been commentary on the discussion about what it is these people have done wrong that they must atone for. Has that ever been discussed? Than just, well, they must have done something wrong and they're going to atone?
As far as I have seen in the scholarship, at least in the incident of Honi, they don't spend time talking about why it is that the rains didn't come in the first place. Right. Now remember, I want to remind you of something. The rabbinic text that we have, the Tosefta, the Mishnah, both the Talmuds, are heavily redacted, heavily edited. The rabbis are framing everything in a way to teach us something. And so the lesson of Honi is not don't do what those folks did that caused it not to rain, or do the things that they didn't do. Like that's just it's immaterial to this particular vignette in the mind of the rabbinic editors. They want us to ask ourselves the other questions about why did Honi do what he did? And more importantly, in the middle of the story, should Honi have done what the people asked? Should Honi have asked God to turn off the rains when it was too much? Because, and this was the big thing the rabbis were saying, rains coming are seen as a blessing. And you never, ever, 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 ever ask for the cessation of a blessing. And so the biggest sort of ideological or maybe even theological challenge in the story of Honi is not that it wasn't raining, or not that Honi demanded rain from God, or not that Honi asked for more rain from God when the rain that came wasn't enough, but that when the rain was too much, Honi asked God to pull back on the water pressure, to turn off the flow. That was the place where the rabbis go, wait a minute, you can't do that. You cannot ask God to make it stop raining. Now, why would they have wanted him to turn off the rain? That's a question I was actually asking of the group. Why might they have asked Honi to turn off the rain? What was wrong?
They were
Destruction.
afraid of a flood.
Yeah, it was too much. It was flooding. As the story will see, they had to run up to the Temple Mount because there was so much water. The valleys below the temple were filling with water. They had to take to higher ground. There was so much rain coming. So it would make sense then, if there's so much rain, to ask. But as we'll see, and I'm going to use this as an opportunity, the rabbis and the people should have known that as much rain that came, it wouldn't have been problematic. So it happened this, and I'm going to read through the first part of the story quickly, and then we'll take it apart when we get to the part that's new today. It happened that they said to Honi the circle drawer, I'm in this second paragraph, pray for rain. He said to them, go and shelter the Passover ovens, that they should not get softened, right? It's pre-Passover. They're cooking the Passover Paschal offering, which is why the ovens that are made of clay are out. He says, go bring them in. They're going to get ruined in the rain. Implies it was close to Passover, maybe even Erev Pesach, maybe even the day that the Seder was that night, or whatever was going to be their Passover observation. The probably wasn't a Seder. This was in pre-Seder times. It was also Seder could have been as much as a month before Passover in this other text, Megillat Ta'anit, a text that has been lost to history, but is alluded to in a variety of places in the rabbinic tradition. On the 20th, all the people fasted for rain, and it fell on them. He prayed, but no rain fell. Rabbi Yossi ben Rabbi Abun said, because he did not come in meekness. Rabbi Yudan, the son of proselyte, said, the Onias, the circle drawer, Onias is the Hellenization of the name Honi, was the grandson of Onias, the circle drawer, who lived close to the destruction of the temple. So for those of you who missed last week, but were here in weeks earlier, we have now introduced two Honis. A Honi who lived in the 6th century BCE, during the time of the destruction of the first temple, and a Honi who lived later on. And they were grandchildren, grandfather, grandson. The early Honi went to the mountain with his workers. While he was there, rain fell. He went into a cave and he was sitting down. He slumbered and fell asleep for 70 years. And in that 70 years, the temple had been destroyed and then rebuilt, right? The destruction in the 560s and rebuilt again in the 520s, 530s, 515s by Ezra and Nehemiah. As the result of the 70 years, he woke up from his sleep. He left the cave and the world had changed. A place where there had been vineyards, now there were olive trees. At a place where there had been olive trees, now it was a field. He asked about the province, and they said to him, what is this news of the world? And he answered, do you not know the news of the world? He said, no. And they asked him, who are you? He said, I am Honi, I am Onias, the circle drawer. They told him, we heard when we had entered the temple courtyard, it lit up. He went there and it lit up. He said to himself, when the eternal leads back to the return of Zion, we were like sleepers. That's the story that the Yerushalmi introduces, that there are two Honis, one from the destruction period and one from later. It also introduces the idea of the 70-year slumber, which, spoiler alert, is going to be adapted and totally reframed by the Babylonian Talmud. So just put that in the back of your mind. 70 years of slumber, Honi, grandkids, it comes back. So Honi asked God for rain. And by the way, I should note, you see how these individual phrases are opening with quotations? They are quotations from the Mishnah. The Talmud is walking us through the Mishnah line by line, graph by graph, and saying, this is what the Mishnah says, and this is what we should understand by it. Rain started to drip. They said this happened only to eliminate one's vow. Reminder, in the Mishnah, Honi swears out a vow that it should rain, which itself is problematic because a normal person can't vow to make it rain, because a normal person can't make it rain. Only God can make it rain. And Honi, in the rabbinic mind, opened himself up to excommunication for taking in public a vow that he could not fulfill. Bad news. Not supposed to take out vows you can't fulfill. Not fulfilling a vow, very dangerous. What do we do in our own time if we take out a vow that we can't fulfill? How do we prevent that danger from coming to pass? Anybody know?
Avoid taking a vow.
So you're supposed to avoid taking a vow. The word, by the way, for a vow in Hebrew is a neder. And in more traditional communities, if you make a promise to someone, there's a custom of saying the phrase bli neder after the promise, which means without a vow. A promise and a vow are different things. A vow is much grander and much more problematic if unfulfilled. And so you promise to meet your friend for coffee next week, bli neder. Let no one think this is a vow. Nancy, did you unmute yourself to make a comment?
No, my apologies. I agree with you on Bli Neder. Thank you.
Okay. We have a prayer that we say every year where we ask God not only to forgive us for not keeping our vows, but to blot out and annul any vow we may have made. Margaret, do you know what blessing that was?
Honi
Yeah, the thing, all our vows.
Yes, thank you, Margaret, and Philip for the pitch in as well. Yes, Kol Nidre, that
Kol Nidre.
blessing that we say every evening on the beginning of Yom, actually technically before Yom Kippur begins, because it's contractual language that we can't do on Yom Kippur itself. But we say, God, please, for any of the vows that we were unable to fulfill, forgive us for not fulfilling it, and more importantly, annul the vow, because we cannot survive the vow not having been fulfilled. Yes, Margaret.
Okay, so we're not supposed to take vows? Is that what you're saying at all? Because aren't there good vows? Like Hannah, she made a vow that she would raise Samuel to, things like that.
So it's not that vows are good or bad. It's that not fulfilling a vow is very, very, very problematic. And so you have to be very, 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 very careful. A vow, by the way, has a particular formula to it. A vow is not you promise. A vow is something usually where you say to God, I am going to vow to restrain my life in certain ways. I'm going to, a Nazarite vows not to cut their hair or not to have any grape product for the benefit of certain things that they might get. So like the language of vows is very, very complicated, but I'll tell you a quick story. This will be the end of my diversion, I promise. There's a story in the Talmud of a woman who very much wants to have children. And so she takes a vow, and she takes a vow because her neighbor asks her to keep a coin in safe handling and safekeeping for a period of time. And it's a very valuable coin. And so he asks her to take a vow on the life of her child that she will reap no benefit from that coin. And she makes the vow. So she decides to hide the coin in the bottom of her flour jar, underneath all of the flour that she keeps in her kitchen. And, she's got the flour jar, so the flour goes down, she fills it up, it goes down, she fills it up. No big deal. Well, one day, many, many, many years later, another neighbor comes by and asks her for a cup of flour. So she takes her scoop, scoops out a cup of flour, gives it to the neighbor. Included in that scoop, accidentally, was the coin that she had offered to keep in safekeeping for her neighbor. And as a result, her child was struck down and died. Such is the power of the vow. Now, how could it possibly be that she broke her vow? Well, the rabbis tell us not that she reaped the value of the benefit of the coin in terms of its actual street value. The value that she reaped as a result of this whole exchange is that her neighbor asked her for a cup of flour. And by giving her a scoop of flour that had the coin in it, she shorted her neighbor the volume of that coin in the amount of flour that she gave. And that little benefit, a coin's volume of flour, that little benefit that she reaped as a result of keeping the coin in her safekeeping was enough to invoke the vow. Our tradition vows are very, very powerful, very, very important, and understood in the later rabbinic world to be quite dangerous. And so they do everything in their power to convince us folks, please don't take vows. You can make promises, you can enter contracts, you can do all that kind of stuff, but don't make these vows, because the risk to you of accidentally not fulfilling it is too great and too grand. And so we should not be making vows, which is why, to Nancy's comment, it's become a custom in more traditional communities to say this thing, bli neder, to make sure that the promise you make is not a vow, it's just a promise, which is a less thing. But Honi made a vow that he would make it rain. And then it began to sprinkle. And then there was this whole conversation that we saw in the Mishnah, sprinkle, schminkle. It hasn't rained in 6 months. This isn't anything. Honi, we need it to be more. Now, the rabbis say that the sprinkling was enough to fulfill Honi's vow, but it wasn't enough to solve the public water crisis. And so it rained more. And so Honi continues, I said, this is not what I was asking for. I was asking for rain to fill the cisterns, the ditches, and the caves. And it rained in a raging storm. And as Samuel says, it was pouring like out of a water skin. It was flooding, it was gushing, it was cats and dogs. Choose your metaphor of rain, or a simile if that works for you too. He said, this is not what I was asking for, but rain of goodwill, of blessing and donation. And so it began to rain normally until Israel moved from Jerusalem to the Temple Mount because of the rain. It was so much rain they had to go up on to the Temple Mount. Or some would suggest it's because there was a roof, right? There was like a portico around the temple that everyone could take shelter in as well. Either way, they all had to retire there. They said to him, just as you were praying for rain to come, so pray to remove the rains. He told them, go and check whether the loser stone was wiped away. The loser stone, remember, is a public place where folks, it's like the lost and found. You find someone's shoes, you bring it there. And that's where everyone knows to go. If I lost my thing, go there. Right? In the Masechet on lost items in Baba Metzia, it's talked about even more about what the loser stone was. Now, he was told it was impossible for that stone to be wiped off the earth. So in the same way, it's impossible to pray that the rain should stop. Right? There are all these things in the rabbinic mindset that suggest that it could never rain too much. But go and bring a bull, he says, as a thanksgiving offering. They went and they brought a bull as a thanksgiving offering. Reminder, the story of Honi takes place during the temple period. It takes place when ritual sacrifices were part of what Jews did. Even though most of our records of the story of Honi come in the post-temple period, in the Tosefta, in the Mishnah, in the Yerushalmi, in the Bavli, each of those texts spend at least some time describing what life was like when the temple stood. The Mishnah and the Tosefta more, the Yerushalmi a good amount as well. By the time we get to Babylonia in the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, the rabbis are less interested in describing what should be done around the temple because they're living in the diaspora. The laws don't apply, but there's still stories there as well. But the story of Honi takes place during the temple period, Second Temple. So he puts his hands on the bull and says, Ribono, my master, you bring evil on your children, and they could not stand it. Talk about chutzpahdik. It's calling God bringing evil. May it be your pleasure to bring relief. The wind blew, the clouds dissolved, the sun shone, and the earth dried. And they went out and they found the desert full of truffles. And they had a delicious, expensive meal after that. But it was free because they harvested the truffles themselves. So Honi does this thing. He asks for the rain to stop, which was new. They asked Rabbi Eliezer. Now this is the rabbis of the Talmud talking. When may one pray for the rains to stop? This is the big question motivating the rabbis. He told them, if a person stands on top of the Ophel, which is a high place in the community, and he can splash his hands in the waters of the valley below, that means most of the community has flooded. And as you know, your grandparents may have said, genug, enough, right? Dainu, it's enough rain, we should stop. But, and this is the difficult part, we trust that the merciful Father, right, God, that God will not bring a deluge over the world. How do we know that? Well, we saw this in the Mishnah and the Tosefta. We see it now in the Yerushalmi, biblical references to the story of Noah. This, to me, is like the waters of Noah, as I swore not to bring Noah's waters another time over the earth. This particular citation is from Isaiah, who references the story of Noah. In the early rabbinic texts, they look at the story of Genesis, but like either way, God made a promise to Noah that God was not going to flood the earth again. And so it would suggest that, as chutzpahdik as Honi was, by standing before God and, let's say it, demanding that God make it rain, it was as or even more chutzpahdik for Honi to say to God, now make it stop. Now make it stop. Any clarifications before we go on? Any questions? I know this is review for some of you. Okay. The next Mishnah, Shimon ben Shetach. Shimon ben Shetach, for those who weren't with us a few weeks ago, is the Nasi. He is the chief rabbi. He's the head of the Sanhedrin. He is the head rabbinic authority. And I need to underscore that in this time period, there were rabbinic Jews, and we all are rabbinic Jews. Jews today are rabbinic Jews. But not all the Jews of Honi's time were rabbinic Jews. If you remember, for example, the Josephus stories of the sects, you have the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Essenes. So the Pharisees are the rabbinic Jews. The Sadducees are the Jews that are committed to the temple ritual. The Essenes are the group who probably were the ones who went out to the caves of Qumran. Most Jews at the time were none of these things. Most Jews were just going about their business, living their lives, planting their fields, and they would follow the need to do certain sacrifices at certain times because that's what Jews did, but they weren't ideologues in the same way. Shimon ben Shetach was the head of the ideologues of the Pharisees or the early rabbis who said, no, the teachings of the oral tradition, that's the key piece of Judaism. And that's the Judaism that survives the destruction of the second temple, of which we are the latest in a string of generations to follow that. So think of Shimon ben Shetach as the voice of rabbinic authority in this conversation, who says to Honi, you should be excommunicated. Why? Well, as I mentioned before, for making that public vow to make it rain, which he was not allowed to do unless you're Honi. But what can I do? Shimon ben Shetach says, since you are behaving before the omnipresent, before God, like a son who misbehaves toward his father who does his will. You are being a petulant son and your father doesn't seem to mind. So how can I possibly chastise you? The one who has greater authority than me has allowed you to behave this way. About you, the verse from Proverbs says, your mother and father will enjoy, and the one who bore you jubilate. Honi, you are first among equals, even more than the Nasi of the Sanhedrin. You have the blessing of God to act and behave this way. And how do we know that Honi has the blessing of God? Anita, unmute yourself first.
Because it rained and then it stopped raining when he asked.
Yeah, because it worked. God did what Honi asked. Right? It's the same question that rabbis say, how do we know if someone is a prophet? Well, we know they're a prophet if their prophecies come true. And if they don't come true, we know that they were a false prophet. Or as they say, the proof is in the pudding. I'll take banana, please, with some Nilla wafers if you have. Right, Honi, what can we do? So the Talmud then continues. Shimon ben Shetach said to him and told him, you should be excommunicated. For if there had been a decision made, as it was decided in the names of Elijah, would you not have caused a desecration of the name in the public? What are they talking about? Everyone who causes a public desecration of the name must be excommunicated. Right? The thing with Elijah is there was a story of Elijah of another somebody asking for it to rain and all this kind of stuff. But the idea is, Honi, you cannot make a public vow like this to make God do what you will. Because what is then the implication for someone who makes a public vow that God will do what they want?
It gives them power, and that's not
Yeah,
good.
you are usurping the ultimate authority. You can't vow to make God do what you want to do. Making these decisions is God's authority, not ours. Even someone, even the Nasi, even the high priest, even Moses. For those of you who remember a few weeks ago, we talked about the circle thing, that Moses, and we think actually it was that the rabbis took the story of Honi and the circle thing and then applied it back to the story of Moses. Moses did this in front of Miriam to ask for God to heal Miriam, and God did. And then Moses also drew a circle around himself when he was told by God that he wouldn't enter the land of Israel, and God didn't do it. Now, Moses didn't make a vow in the way that Honi did, but he used it as a way to dramatically inveigh upon God to make something happen, right? What we know from that is God listened to Moses vis-a-vis Miriam because God wanted to heal Miriam. And God didn't listen to Moses vis-a-vis Moses entering the land because God didn't want Moses to enter the land. But Moses didn't take a vow in the same way like Honi did, right? Or as the text suggests, there we have stated, Rabban Gamliel said to him, if you hinder the public, you will cause a deluge. Would you not hinder the public from performing a meritorious act? And any who would hinder the public from performing a meritorious act must be communicated. He answered, Honi, does not the Holy One, praise God, cancel God's decision because of the decision of just one person? Yes. The Holy One, praise to God, may cancel God's decision because of the decision of just one person. but God will not cancel the decision of one person just because of the decision of his colleague. This is getting to be rabbinic legal wordplay. But what we see, and we see this in Psalms, and we see this in other places in the Talmud, is that God kind of will do, to a degree, what people who are just ask of God, if the thing is just itself. And the conversation in the Talmud is going to explicate this more. But the rabbis in general, I want to just sort of put a blanket on this, are just really uncomfortable with what Honi did. Because if Honi what makes Honi think he's so special? Other people may be tempted to act the same way, to either usurp God's authority or to usurp the rabbi's authority. And so they're trying to tell everyone, don't do as Honi did. Even though it was effective, it was the wrong thing to do. Right? The Mishnah says, what can I, or in the Mishnah, Shimon ben Shetach says to Honi, what can I do? You are misbehaving like one before God, like a son who misbehaves before a father, and the father continues to do your will. Rabbi Barachia, Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana, Rabbi Zera says in the name of Rabbi Yehuda. In some states, the name of Rabbi Chisda, in some the name of Rabbi Matana. You decide the command, and God confirms it for you. That's a verse from Job. In this instance, what they're saying is, you ask God to do it, and God did it, which is different than God doing what you wanted, not out of God's own volition. There's a complicated piece here, which is, if we make a prayer to God and that prayer comes true, when did God decide to do what we asked of God? Was it that it was already going to happen anyway, and our prayer just came true because it was going to happen? Or did our prayer make God change God's mind? And this is not an answer to which, this is not a question to which there is only one answer in our tradition. There's a lot of different ways the rabbinic tradition and various rabbis at different points think about the chain of events between us making prayers or us making requests of God, and then it happening. It's clear in our tradition that we are allowed to ask things of God. We do it every day, 3 times a day. Right? The middle 13 blessings in the weekday tefillah are known as the bakashot, the requests, where we ask God for wisdom and for healing and for patience and for peace and for rebuilding of the temple and for all the Mashiach and all this kind of stuff. We have in our theology that we can ask things of God. And our theology allows God to be the one to make the decision as to whether or not those things come to be. And we see in Job a little bit of, yeah, you asked for this stuff, but it's because God was already going to do it anyway. When the verse says, for you, meaning God confirms it for you, but even if I am saying so, and you are saying otherwise, yours is enduring, mine is not enduring. The source of this is interesting. On your path shines light. Rabbi Chia Bar Abba says this is rainfall. And as heavy as God has loaded the rain cloud, his light will disperse the cloud from Job. Right? The notion is, throughout all of this, that yes, God was answering what Onias wanted to do, but it was God's will that ultimately decided. And that's important. That's important because it answers, or it leads us to an answer of this question. Who was Honi? I didn't define these terms today, but the magician or the miracle worker or the charismatic holy man is seen by some in the tradition as a person acting outside the bounds of God's authority, right? A good example of this might be in the story of the plagues of Egypt, at least in the earlier plagues. What happens? Moses and Aaron go before God. They say God's going to cause a plague. The plague happens. And then what happens? Anyone remember? How is Pharaoh not convinced by the first few plagues?
His magicians could do it.
Who's magician, Steve?
The Pharaoh.
Yeah, Pharaoh has magicians who can replicate the plagues that God brought. Okay. Well, if that's the case, then it would suggest that there are people who can do at least certain things outside of God's will, outside of God's desire. That is a big theological question that we could answer, right? Now, you could also say that God allowed the magicians to do those things because it was part of the necessary dialogic and part of the necessary experience that Moses needed Pharaoh to go through and that God needed the Israelites to go through to ultimately allow us to go free. That God wanted the magicians to replicate plagues 1, 2, and 3 or whatever, however many, so that God could then bring the other ones that they couldn't replicate. But now that's very much sort of inside baseball. But it's a big question, right? Is everything within God's power? Or are there things that are outside of God's power? And if there are things that are outside of God's power, there might be things that a magician or a miracle worker or a holy man might do, of which there are other conversations like this throughout our tradition. And so it would make sense that the rabbis of the Jerusalem Talmud are exploring some of that stuff. Let me find where we were. Or, no, this was all God's doing. The filling of the cloud, the little bit of rain, the lot of rain, the too much rain is exactly what God wanted to do to advance the story of Honi the Circlemaker. For those humbled you order elevation, another verse from Job. If I had said to humble them and you say to elevate them, then yours is enduring. Mine is not. And the one of low eyes will be saved. I shall bring their eyes low by misfortune that you are saving them. Yours enduring, mine is not. What's happening is the rabbis are looking at these texts mostly from Job to try to figure out who's in charge here. Is Honi in charge here or is God in charge here? What means, and he will escape by the purity of our hands, by the choice of our hands, by the meritorious deeds, merit of meritorious deeds and good works which are in your hands before. This is very esoteric. But they're going back and forth to say, listen, if you're making good things happen, if you're doing ultimately good, like how can I possibly say there's anything wrong with what you did? The ends justify the means to a certain degree. And then we have this verse from Proverbs: your mother and father will enjoy, and the one who bore you jubilates, which is how the rabbis of the Mishnah describe Honi as being, the favorite child of God. Why does the verse say the one who bore you? Why does the verse that mentions your father and mother and the one who bore you, why do the rabbis ask why it says the one who bore you? What are they poking at? What are they wondering about? Margaret.
Well, it's about creation. I mean, it's about God really is the person who created us, I think.
Yeah.
And
what they're saying is when you read the first verse from Proverbs about someone who mentions your mother, your father, and the one who bore you, those are not the same people. There's your mother and there's your father, and there's the one who bore you. And who's the one who bore you? Rabbi Mana said, your nation is the one who bore you. Rabbi Yossi ben Rabbi Ehud said, but your time. But the rabbis are saying, just as he brings a double curse, he brings a double joy. A silly son to anger his father, and bitterness is the one who bore him. A wise son brings joy to his father, but a silly son is sadness to his mother. What is this tuga of his mother, the sadness? Rabbi Luda said it is the encrypted language, ashes in his mother's eyes. This is wordplay here. And where does he bring the double joy to her? Your mother and father will enjoy, and the one who bore you jubilate. The gematria of the word sadness is the same as the gematria for the word afara, meaning ashes. Again, the rabbis are turning all these things on their head. And they're poking at this, they're poking a lot of holes at the story of in the Mishnah of trying to understand who this guy Honi was. And what did he or did he not do? Did he break the laws of space and time by doing what God wouldn't have wanted to do? Did he usurp God's authority? Or, asked another way, was God in on it all along? And was God working through him by raising these questions, which would bring him closer to a prophet? And I think it's not unusual that they would be doing this at a period when the rabbis of the Talmud are trying to create their own authority for a community that was used to authority coming from the priests and authority coming from the prophets, neither of whom are still operating, but God still is. And then they're trying to use the story to say something about authority. What does the story accomplish? Well, one thing that it does is that it sharpens this idea of communal redemption, right? The communal punishment or lack thereof of the reigning, right? It's all about the people. Honi isn't doing this for himself. He's doing it for the people. The people turned to him and asked him to make it better for us. The second thing it does is it takes the conversation away from Honi and who he was vis-a-vis other people and more about his righteousness. It brings him, I think, closer to relationship with God and less about who do you think you are that you can do this, right? Especially in that tension between Honi and Shimon ben Shetach, the Nasi, right? Which in some ways squares the circle. And by that I mean, in the Mishnah, you see tension between the rabbinic authority and Honi. Honi is doing things that he doesn't have the authority to do, not from God, not from the rabbis. And the Mishnah brings that out very clearly. However, the Yerushalmi spends a lot of time saying, no. See, you got to understand, Honi wasn't doing this for him. He was doing it for everybody. And even though he was acting outside of the rabbinic authority, he was acting on behalf of the people. He was acting in a righteous manner. He was trying to do good. And God recognized that. So sorry, Shimon ben Shetach, that he didn't partner with you on this work. But God wanted Honi to do this. God let Honi know that he was, the most favored son, so to speak, of the community, so that they could do this. And that's why the Talmud spends sometimes lifting up Honi in his character as a righteous person to answer the question, well, why would have God treated Honi that way? Well, because of his righteousness. Bringing authority to Palestinian, meaning land of Israel folks and their institutions, like the Temple Mount, like the lost item stone. Places that the people of that community would have been important. Why did that matter? Well, remember, we're talking about 300s, 400s, 500s of the Common Era as the Yerushalmi is being redacted. the future of the Jewish community, where it's going to be situated, where we can exert authority is very much in question. Who's in charge of the land of Israel at this time? The Roman authorities. How much power do we have there? Not so much, right? We escaped Jerusalem. We went to Yavne, and eventually rabbis began to migrate north and east, some of whom continued to hang out in the land of Israel, some of whom continued on into Babylonia. And there's definitely some tension there as to authority. The authors of the Yerushalmi are given a gift with this story from Honi because it very clearly takes place where? In the land of Israel. And so in a world in which the rabbis who have immigrated to Babylonia are beginning to and are going to continue to strive to make Babylonia the heart of the Jewish community, it's a place that they had to worry about. I'm just seeing, by the way, now in the chat, your comments, Julian, about the vow thing. Yeah, vows are dangerous, as you wrote, and they were not to be made lightly, and people were tempted to make it lightly, like kids say, swear to God, right? Like, that's what God was afraid of. A vow was a very specific thing to get a very specific outcome, like a child, like in the story of Hannah, for example. So it was a powerful tool that God gave. Eleni asks, is it possible God decides in advance before you ask? Oh, I love that question, because it allows me to offer one of my favorite teachings in our tradition, which in Hebrew reads, Hakol tzafui v'hareshut netuna, which means everything is foreseen and authority is given, which means we humans have free will. God does not make our decisions for us. We get to decide. And God knows what we're going to decide even before we do. And then Julian wrote, maybe God can choose to use intermediary forces like angels to accomplish some miracles, so people with bad intentions are able to accept those intermediaries, or to allow Moses the power of good, perhaps also to allow Bilam the possess power of apparent dark side for the sake of balance and justice. I think that's right to all of that. The question is, for me, like, I see the story in Bilam, for example, as still being the way God wanted it to be. That God is acting, like, is creating negative things like prophecies that are negative, or magicians who are helping support Pharaoh. It's part of all part of the plan, all part of the way that God wants us to make it happen. For sure, there's not a prophecy. In fact, we're told that Bilam is an even more effective prophet than Moses. It's just that he wasn't an Israelite. And his prophecies came true because our tents were, in fact, pretty good. A few more accomplishments, and then we're going to end a moment early because I have another call at 1 o'clock. Building tension and suspense by starting with Honi's initial impotence. It's just a little bit of rain, and his arrogance. Look at me, how good I am. The Yerushalmi text is not a particularly easy one to understand, and I try to take apart as much of it as I could and deliver it in a very quick fashion. Next week, we're going to relook at the story of Honi in the Babylonian Talmud, which is our authoritative story. It's actually shorter than the Yerushalmi. The story from it not being raining to the rains ending. But then we get a beautiful second act and third act in the story of Honi that only exists in the Babylonian Talmud, which is, frankly, in my part, my favorite part of the story. So with that, I wish you all a wonderful week, and we will see you next Tuesday, the 30th at noon, for the final act of Honi the Circlemaker. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.